Corn. Some may hate it, others may love it, but we all must agree that it has had a significant impact on the world we live in now. From being used in ceremonies to being a nutritional staple food, corn has cultivated the world, as the world has cultivated it. But what about corn's not-so-distant cousin, popcorn? Hundreds of thousands of years ago, in the early age of humanity, humans have learned to use fire. As time went on, humans learned how to cultivate foods. Eventually, food was combined with flame, dawning on us our modern food sources, with heated foods spanning across several categories. Anything that is consumable has been put into flame, for our curious nature and arsonistic tendencies has compelled us to burn things for ages. When corn met fire, a crunchy, low-calorie food was created, popcorn. In this regard, maybe popcorn is not so much a distant cousin as it is the son of corn. Let us now travel to the origin of corn and popcorn, going back several generations of humankind. Ancient Southern America. The date, 9,000 years ago. For the first time in Mexico, corn was being domesticated. Over the course of thousands of years, Mexican maize would artificially be bred and selected to produce our common corn. But when was the first instance of popcorn? Archaeological evidence suggests that it was much earlier than we perceived. Let us go now to Peru, around 3,000 years later. In the coastal archaeology sites of Perdones and Huaca Prieta, the remains of 3 cobs of ancient corns were found. The scientists at hand used radiocarbon dating and analysis of many aspects of the cobs. They were able to determine the age as being around 6,700 years old. And one of the oldest cobs found was, indeed, popcorn. Popcorn was mainly popped by hand on an earthen oven stovetop. The most common variety of maize used was the white or yellow kernel corn. Rest in peace, black corn. It was popped on the cob, then taken off and used to eat. Corn would not have been a maiden staple in diets at this point. Rather, it would have been a luxury. This is where we must leap forward in time, into the Common Era. There is evidence to suggest that during the early centuries, corn was grown, traded, and consumed all over the Western Hemisphere, long before the European colonizers ever entered in. This would be the reason corn, and especially popcorn, became less of a luxury and more of a day-to-day food. Popcorn around this later time would likely have been popped through dried kernels on a stovetop, thus making it resemble corn nuts. It only has become fluffy in recent years as strains of maize have been carefully selected and popping techniques have improved. Let us now dive into Mexico during the post-classical era and take a look at Aztec culture. A common place we have a record of Aztec ceremonies is from the conquistadors' notes, as well as other Spanish and Portuguese writings. Records from Hernan Cortez's first journey discuss the use of popcorn in a festival in honor of Tlaloc, the god of rain. Strings of popcorn were hung around traditional headdresses and costumes, and garlands of popcorn were strung across dancers. They scattered before him parched corn called momochitl, a kind of corn which bursts when parched and discloses its contents and makes itself look like a very white flower. They said these were hailstones given to the god of water, one Spanish account stated. Another festival was Toxcatl, which lasted throughout most of the month of May. Popcorn and other foods were offered to the water gods in hope of a good harvest season. It is on the bigger end of festivals, with many popcorn dances and blessing offerings. Tragically, Toxcatl in 1520 was the site of the conquistador massacre of Aztec peoples. The Historia General de las Cosas de la Nueva España, or Florentine Codex as the English so kindly dubbed it, was a collection of ethnographic studies conducted by a Spaniard named Friar Bernardino de Sahagún. The first edition was published in 1577, and the data in it had been collected for years. In the words of the friar himself, we are given yet another glimpse of the popcorn culture. Popcorn is a kind of corn which bursts when parched and discloses its contents and makes itself look like a very white flower. And a number of young women danced, having so vowed a popcorn dance. As thick as tassels of maize were their popcorn garlands, and these they placed upon the girls' heads. As time went on, maize would travel throughout the world. As maize spread through the Columbian Exchange, the knowledge of the luscious crops of crunchy child went with it. The next major development to study comes from about 200 years ahead of the New Spain discoveries. We shall now head north to the plainest area of the United States. See what I did there? Plainest? Because we have plains. Well, it is true that corn probably ended up in the US a couple of thousand years ago. It was not commonly produced until the 1800s. It's time to cut to our sponsor of the day, the steel plow, brought to you by John Deere. Not the lawnmower company, the Illinois man that the lawnmower company is named after. The steel plow came in about 1837 on the cusp of America's Industrial Revolution. It became increasingly produced more and more, for it single-handedly changed the efficiency of farming. Most importantly, the steel plow gave way to the mass cultivation of corn, or what would later be dubbed prairie gold. This large burst of corn occurred in the US's Corn Belt, aka the states nobody cares about unless you're a farmer. I think it's time to go back to the best form of corn now. The type of corn that is called prairie gold often is the strain of corn best suited for popping. By the late 1840s, popcorn had become such a key food that it was being put into dictionaries as a legitimate word. By the 1870s and 80s, devices such as Frederick J. Meyer's corn popping device from 1875 were designed specifically to make popcorn popping easier. In 1885, Charles Creters of Chicago created a mobile machine that made popcorn vendors' jobs much easier. Eventually, buttering and salting mechanisms were added into the contraption, and thus the dawn of the popcorn cart came upon the world. Other forms of popcorn, such as the prize-containing Cracker Jack, created 1892, or forms of caramel corn, cheese corn, and many others began to be patented in the early 20th century. Corn and popcorn alike rose in popularity, so much so that they began to be celebrated in culture, which I would like to say was thoroughly entertaining to read. I mean, a full 300-page book of poems and stories about corn, that is such an Iowa thing. Apologies, I digressed. As time continued, the technology continued to develop. Popcorn began to appear in different places, particularly the movie theaters and sports events of America. With attendances of movie theaters and arenas on the rise, food vendors took note, and despite bans on snacks in theaters, vendors began to push to sell snacks, and people loved it. The entertainment industries lifted these bans and adopted popcorn, something that is still true today. Popcorn began to bring in huge amounts of wealth to farmers who sold their corn to the vendor industry. It became a valuable means of gaining income during the Great Depression, if you ignore the fact that several states could not farm due to the Dust Bowl. On a similar note, due to popcorn's inexpensive nature, it became a breakfast food for many, and a luxury several could afford. It is a low-calorie and filling snack, and easy to buy and/or cook. It is likely that popcorn was the inspiration for many cereals. As the popcorn industry was one of few to thrive during the Great Depression, more and more people began to consume it, and some even started using it for holidays, just like the Aztecs before them had done. Christian holiday Christmas and America's national holiday Thanksgiving often featured popcorn in the shapes of popcorn balls, garlands, and tree ornaments. It is interesting to study the chronology of popcorn, for throughout every war and slump in American stability, popcorn was consumed at much higher rates. In World War II, popcorn was eaten 3 times as much, for, as we have seen, it was inexpensive, easy to make, and one of the only foods not being largely sent to the troops. Decades later, the microwave became commonplace, and popcorn yet again boomed in popularity for its healthy qualities. Microwavable popcorn raked in tens of millions of dollars a year. In modern times, popcorn can be bought pre-popped, in microwavable bags, in kernel-formed, cheesed, carameled, and in many other shapes, tastes, and forms. For centuries, humans have been aiming at finding the perfect moisture-dryness ratio of kernels, and now that we have achieved it through genetically modified organisms, the fluffy popcorn has been cemented as the best kind. I would like to end this documentary by reading a selection from the 1917 compilation of Iowa authors and artists' works related to corn that I mentioned before. This poem is entitled A Ballad of the Corn by S.H.M. Byers. Oh, the undulating prairies and the fields of yellow corn, like a million soldiers waiting for the fray. Oh, the rustling of the corn leaves like a distant fairy's horn, and the notes the fairy bugles seemed to play. We have risen from the bosom of the beauteous Mother Earth, where farmer plowed his furrow straight and long. There was gladness and rejoicing when that summer gave us birth, and the tumult and the dancing and the song. Here are all sources I used in the process of making this documentary, and I hope you thoroughly enjoyed